In the endless silence of space, there existed a place where thousands of worlds came together, a shining circle known as the Galactic Council. It was not made of stone or steel but of light. The chamber floated above a dying star, surrounded by transparent walls that let every visitor see the swirling colors of nebulae and the distant sparkle of galaxies. Every race in the known universe had a seat there. Tall beings with crystal skin, insect-like diplomats who spoke through music, and creatures made of light that flickered when they talked. Each of them believed that the council was proof that peace could last forever, and for a long time it did. When humanity first joined, many in the galaxy doubted them. Compared to the ancient races who had survived 1,000,000 years of wars, humans were new, barely crawling out of their home system. The council saw them as emotional, unpredictable, and stubborn, but they also saw something else, a species that had learned again and again how to rebuild from ashes. At first, humans sat quietly in the background, learning the ways of the council. They were patient listeners, careful observers. When they spoke, it was often about fairness, balance, and understanding. Other races began to notice that human words carried a strange kind of warmth, a belief that even enemies could become friends. Over the years, humanity earned respect. They mediated between species that had hated each other for centuries. They offered trade deals that benefited all sides. Their ships brought medicine, food, and knowledge to struggling worlds. For the first time in centuries, the galaxy felt united. But as peace grew stronger, something else quietly began to fade: honesty. The council had grown powerful, almost untouchable. Behind closed doors, decisions were made not for peace but for control. Some worlds were taxed until they starved. Some systems were ignored when they begged for help. Yet in the grand chamber, everything appeared perfect. Speeches were made, agreements were signed, and the illusion of unity remained. Humans noticed. They had seen this pattern before, on their own world, in their own history. They knew what it looked like when power slowly replaced purpose. But instead of speaking out, they waited. They believed they could change things from within. That reason would win over politics. Then came the meeting that changed everything. The council called an emergency session. The issue on the table was the Sarnath system, a cluster of 7 worlds orbiting a blue sun. For centuries, it had been home to a peaceful civilization. But now the star was dying, and the council had decided it was too costly to save. The proposal was simple: move the valuable resources to another system, and relocate the Sarnath people somewhere less important. When the human representatives arrived, they found the chamber unusually tense. The alien delegates were restless. Some avoided eye contact. Others spoke in cold, measured tones. It was clear that the decision had already been made before the humans even entered the room. At the center of the table, the high speaker of the council, a tall being of silver light, addressed them all. "Survival," it said, "is not about fairness. It is about function. The Sarnath population will be transferred to the mining moons of Kalor. Their home will be harvested to sustain the needs of the greater alliance." A murmur spread through the chamber. The words were polite, but the meaning was cruel. The Sarnath would lose everything: their sky, their seas, their history. The human delegates listened quietly. They didn't interrupt, didn't raise their voices. But their silence had weight. One of them finally stood, adjusting the small badge of earth on their chest. The badge caught the light of the dying star outside the window. "Are we truly doing this?" they asked softly. "Are we agreeing to erase an entire world because it is easier than saving it?" The chamber went silent. The other delegates looked away. The high speaker tilted its head, its glowing face unreadable. "You misunderstand," it replied. "This is not destruction. It is redirection. Their species will survive, but that is mercy enough." For a long time, no one spoke. The human looked around the vast chamber, at the hundreds of species gathered, each sitting behind symbols of power. The silence was louder than any explosion. When the human finally spoke again, their voice was calm but cold. "Mercy without choice is not mercy at all." Some of the delegates shifted uncomfortably. Others whispered to each other. The high speaker simply flickered, then moved on to the next order of business as if nothing had happened. The vote was called. One by one, the counselors raised their hands, hundreds of glowing signals appearing in the air like falling stars. The proposal passed. All eyes turned to the human seat. The council waited for them to raise their hand too. After all, that was the way things had always worked. Everyone followed the flow. Everyone pretended to agree, and peace was maintained by silence. But that day, the humans didn't move. Their hands stayed still. Their gaze was steady. The room grew colder, the air heavier. Even the light seemed to dim, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The high speaker frowned, its voice echoing. "Earth delegation, you have not voted," the human replied quietly, "because this is not a vote worth casting." A wave of whispers filled the chamber. Disbelief, confusion, anger. No one had ever refused to participate before. The rules didn't even have a word for it. The high speaker tried again. "You are bound by the council charter to respond. Your silence will be recorded as abstention." The humans shook their head. No, recorded as rejection. And with that, they stood. The sound of the chair sliding back was small, almost gentle, but in the vast chamber, it echoed like thunder. The human gathered their documents, turned, and began to walk toward the exit. The other human delegates followed without a word. The entire room watched, stunned. For a moment, no one understood what was happening. No one had ever walked out of the council chamber. Not in centuries of meetings, not even during wars. The high speaker called after them. "If you leave now, you leave the alliance of stars." The human paused at the door and looked back only once. "Then perhaps the stars have lost their light," they said quietly. And then they were gone. The chamber remained silent long after the humans disappeared. Some delegates tried to continue the meeting, but their voices trembled. Others stared at the empty seats where humanity had once sat. The symbols of Earth and its colonies still glowed faintly, a reminder of their presence. It was a small act, just a walk, just a refusal. But in that moment, the galaxy changed, because everyone knew what humans were capable of when they felt betrayed. They had been builders and healers, yes, but also survivors. They had endured wars that tore their own planet apart. They had rebuilt cities from dust, crossed oceans of fire, and faced extinction more than once. And now they had turned their backs not in anger, but in disappointment. That was what frightened the council most. For the first time, the galaxy saw that humanity's strength was not in its weapons or technology, but in its will, a will that could not be bought, threatened, or persuaded. They had joined the council for unity. Now they were leaving it for something greater, conscience. As the meeting finally ended, one of the older alien delegates whispered to another, "They didn't just walk away from the table, they walked away from us all." And somewhere far beyond the council's reach, Earth ships began to turn toward home. No one knew what would happen next, but one truth hung heavy in every heart across every world. The humans had made their choice and the universe was watching. The chamber of the Galactic Council had never been so quiet. The sound of the humans' footsteps still seemed to echo long after they were gone. The other delegates sat frozen in disbelief. No one had dared to walk out before, not in all the long history of the council. To defy a collective decision was seen as an insult to the unity of the stars. But the humans had done it without anger, without shouting, without threats. They had simply stood up and walked away. At first, the council tried to pretend it didn't matter. The high speaker declared that the session would continue as planned. The decision about the Sarnath system was finalized, the files were sealed, and the counselors moved on to other topics as if nothing unusual had happened. But behind those calm words, something had shifted. Everyone in that chamber knew that the balance of the galaxy had cracked, quietly but deeply. Outside the meeting hall, word of what had happened spread fast. The council's aides and attendants whispered in the hallways. News drones from different worlds transmitted reports to their home systems. Every headline carried the same shocking message: the humans have refused the vote. At first, no one understood what it meant. Some believed it was just a misunderstanding, that Earth's representatives would return after a day or two. Others thought it was a political stunt, a way for humans to demand more influence in council decisions. But those who truly knew humanity sensed something different. They had seen the look in the humans' eyes before they left, a quiet certainty that comes from people who have already made up their minds. The council tried to control the situation. They sent messages to Earth, asking for clarification. No reply came. They called for private meetings with human diplomats stationed on other worlds. Those diplomats, polite but firm, simply said, "Earth will respond when it is ready." Then they packed their things and returned home. Across the galaxy, confusion turned to tension. The humans had always been strange to the older civilizations. They smiled too easily, forgave too quickly, and yet when pushed they stood their ground like mountains. Other species often said that humans were too emotional for diplomacy. They cared too much about fairness, too much about right and wrong. The Council had always seen that as a weakness, something that made humans naive. But now that very emotion had become something else, a quiet, unbreakable conviction. Behind the Council's shining walls, discussions grew heated. Some members said the humans needed to be punished, that leaving the chamber was a breach of the Charter. Others argued that forcing them back would only make things worse. But no one could deny one simple fact: humanity's absence left a hole no one could fill. It wasn't just about politics. Humanity had been the bridge between worlds. When two civilizations refused to talk, it was the humans who arranged the meeting. When trade disagreements broke out, it was human negotiators who found middle ground. When peace treaties were signed, it was human diplomats who wrote the final words. Their belief in cooperation wasn't just talk. It was the glue that held the Council together. Now, that glue was gone. Inside the Council halls, the High Speaker tried to sound calm. "The alliance will continue," it said in its echoing voice. "The loss of one world does not end the unity of thousands." But even as those words filled the chamber, everyone knew the truth. It wasn't just one world. It was the heart of their moral balance, the only voice that dared to remind the galaxy what conscience meant. Meanwhile, on Earth, silence ruled. The humans didn't issue statements or hold press conferences. Their government channels remained offline. The colonies that once traded daily with other species suddenly turned inward. Cargo ships that had once carried goods to the Council worlds began to return home, empty. And yet there was no sign of aggression, no sign of preparation for war, just quiet withdrawal. It was as if an entire species had decided to step back and watch. The Council couldn't understand it. In their long history, disagreements had always been solved with negotiation, or threats, or compromise. But humanity wasn't negotiating this time. They weren't asking for anything. They had simply said no and walked away. Weeks turned into months. The relocation of the Sarnath people went ahead as planned. But something strange happened. The process, which was supposed to be simple, began to fall apart. Cargo ships broke down. Mining equipment malfunctioned. Navigation systems failed. No one could explain why. Some said it was sabotage. Others said it was fate. But deep down, everyone knew the real reason. Human engineers had designed many of those systems. Without them, everything became harder. In meetings, Council members began to argue. Small things turned into big conflicts. Trade routes started closing. Minor worlds refused to follow new laws. Old rivalries, once kept in check by human mediation, began to reappear. It was as if the humans had been holding the galaxy's chaos at bay. And now, the chaos was free again. On one distant world, a group of Council advisors gathered in a private room. The discussion was quiet but serious. "We underestimated them," one said. "We thought they needed us. But maybe it was the other way around." Another shook their head. "They are emotional creatures. They will come back once they realize they cannot live without the Council's protection." But someone else whispered, "Protection? They never needed protection. They survived their own wars, their own hunger, their own storms. What protection do they need from us?" The room fell silent after that. The Council tried again to reach out. Messages were sent, diplomatic ships dispatched. None were answered. When one Council ship approached Earth's orbit to deliver a personal letter of apology, it was met not with hostility, but silence. A simple message appeared on their comm screen. "We no longer sit at your table." That single sentence traveled across the stars. Millions saw it. Some laughed. Some felt fear. But others, especially those who had once been ignored or oppressed by the Council's decisions, felt hope. If the humans could walk away, maybe they could too. The Council began to worry. A few smaller worlds started to question their own loyalty. "If Earth can leave," they said, "why can't we?" The High Speaker tried to suppress such talk, declaring it dangerous and divisive. But the more they tried to control the story, the more it spread. Humanity's silence had become louder than any speech. In the quiet corners of the galaxy, ordinary people talked about it, traders, workers, explorers. They remembered how humans had helped them in times of crisis. They remembered the doctors, the teachers, the engineers who had come to their worlds not for profit, but because they believed in kindness. And now those same humans had said, enough. It made everyone look at themselves a little differently. Some council members began to wonder privately if they had gone too far. The Sarnath decision had been logical, yes, efficient, yes, but it had also been heartless. The humans had seen that immediately. The others had chosen to ignore it. And now they were paying the price. Months later, a young delegate from a small colony stood in the chamber and asked, "What if they were right?" The high speaker glowed brighter as if angered. Right? They abandoned unity. But maybe, the delegate replied softly, they abandoned something that had already lost its meaning. The chamber fell silent again. No one dared to respond. Outside, in the vastness of space, Earth remained quiet. Satellites still orbited, ships still moved between the Moon and Mars, but beyond that, human presence faded. It was as if they had drawn a line around their part of the galaxy and said, "This far, no more." No one knew what humanity was planning. Were they retreating to rebuild? Or preparing something new? Every attempt to spy or probe their systems ended with the same result. Blank signals, scrambled data, nothing returned. It was as if the humans had erased themselves from the galactic map, but they hadn't vanished. They were simply watching. Watching how the Council handled the world it had chosen to sacrifice. Watching how the galaxy behaved without them. And though the Council pretended not to care, the truth was clear. Their confidence had cracked. Every decision now came with hesitation. Every speech sounded hollow, because deep down they all knew they had betrayed more than a system. They had betrayed principle, and humanity had noticed. The air inside the Galactic Council's chamber had never felt heavier. The humans had left, but their presence was still felt in every corner. Chairs sat empty, papers untouched, and the soft hum of the Council's energy field seemed to pulse slower, as if reflecting the absence of the species that had once held the room together. It was a quiet kind of rebellion, one without violence, without anger, yet more powerful than any weapon the Council had ever seen. The Council tried to continue as if nothing had happened. Discussions moved to trade agreements and security patrols, but every word seemed hollow. Delegates glanced at the empty human seats, the symbols of Earth faintly glowing, and even the most confident negotiators faltered. They had all witnessed something extraordinary. To walk away from the Council, to reject centuries of expectation, required courage beyond comprehension, and it had shaken the very foundation of interstellar diplomacy. At first, the Council attempted to reassure itself. "Humans are young," a delegate from a crystalline world murmured. "They lack the experience to see the bigger picture. They will return." Others nodded, though uncertainty lingered behind their eyes. No one wanted to admit that perhaps humans were not returning, because they no longer felt the need to be part of the Council at all. Inside Earth's orbit, human ships moved steadily toward the inner planets. There was no fanfare, no speeches, no announcement to the galaxy. The crew on these ships went about their routines with calm efficiency. They were not fleeing. They were not preparing for war. They were simply taking a step back, observing, waiting, and ensuring their own world remained untainted by the corruption they had witnessed in the Council. For humans, this was not an act of anger. It was a matter of principle. They had been taught from the earliest days of their civilization that fairness and morality were not negotiable. They had learned that compromise was often necessary, but never at the cost of conscience. And the Council's decision to displace an entire species for convenience, to erase their home for efficiency, crossed a line humans could not ignore. Across the galaxy, the ripple effect of their departure began to show. Minor disputes, long held in check by the humans' mediation, escalated quickly. Worlds that had once cooperated started to break apart over disagreements that seemed trivial in comparison to what had happened in the Sarnath system. Trade routes faltered. Supply lines became unreliable. Even the oldest civilizations, whose histories spanned millions of years, found themselves unprepared for the chaos that followed. In the council chambers, tension grew to an almost unbearable level. Delegates whispered among themselves, trying to understand what had happened. "Did we misjudge them?" one asked. "Did we think them naive, but they were wiser than we realized?" Another replied, "Perhaps it is not wisdom but courage." They saw a wrong and refused to be part of it. The high speaker, usually so composed and unyielding, found itself struggling to maintain authority. Its voice, though echoing across the chamber, lacked the certainty it once held. Orders given to enforce decisions fell flat. Communications to human colonies went unanswered. Even the Council's security forces, vast and technologically advanced, found themselves powerless to influence Earth or its people. Meanwhile, humans did not seek to punish or interfere with the galaxy. They watched quietly, studying the consequences of the Council's actions. From the surface of Earth and its nearby colonies, they monitored trade disruptions, political unrest, and growing uncertainty. It was not vengeance they sought. It was awareness, a chance for the galaxy to witness the cost of its own moral compromises. For the human delegates, there was a sense of solemn responsibility. They had chosen to leave, and they knew that every ripple would affect countless worlds. They carried no weapons. They made no threats. Their only tools were observation, patience, and the unwavering principle that some actions could not be justified, no matter the reason. In the months that followed, the Council grew increasingly desperate. Messages were sent to Earth daily, pleading for explanations, asking for a return to the negotiation table. Each one was ignored or returned with the same simple message: "We will return when it is right." The lack of hostility was maddening to the Council. Humans could have been provoked, threatened, or bribed, yet they remained steadfastly calm, as if the very act of walking away was enough to demonstrate their position. In smaller council chambers across the galaxy, debates erupted. Some species began to question their own loyalty to the High Speaker and the Council's decisions. If humans could leave, refusing to bow to the system, what did that mean for everyone else? Slowly, murmurs of dissent began to grow into discussions. Minor worlds demanded autonomy. Colonies questioned old alliances. Trade disputes, once suppressed, began to flare. Even the Council's oldest members realized that the humans had not simply abandoned a meeting. They had abandoned a pattern that had allowed corruption to hide behind tradition. Within the Council, one elder being finally admitted what many had suspected in private. "We have underestimated them," it said softly. "All these years we judged humans by their youth, their history, their lack of longevity. But we failed to see what makes them strong, a refusal to compromise on what is right. They are not naive. They are unwavering." That observation alone caused a ripple of unease. If humans were indeed unwavering, what would happen if they chose to intervene in other ways? For the Council, the thought was terrifying. A species that could walk away without fear of consequence was a species that could one day redefine the balance of power in the galaxy. Not with weapons, not with force, but with sheer principle. In distant colonies, ordinary people watched the news from the Council's transmission channels. Traders, farmers, scientists, all began to understand that humans were doing something different. Humans were demonstrating that morality could outweigh authority. They were showing that one species could take a stand without creating chaos deliberately. Yet the act alone would ripple across the universe, even among humans themselves. The choice to leave was not taken lightly. Every diplomat, every observer, understood the weight of their actions. They knew that worlds could suffer in the absence of their guidance. They knew that systems would struggle, that minor conflicts could escalate. Yet they believed that no amount of compromise could justify their participation in a system that valued convenience over conscience. On Earth, life continued as usual, at least on the surface. Cities thrived, research continued, and daily routines carried on. But beneath that calm, humans were more vigilant than ever. They prepared for the possibility that the galaxy might attempt to force them back. They refined their technology, improved their communications, and strengthened their observation networks. And yet, all of this was done quietly, with no aggression, no domination, and no desire for power. What humanity sought was simple, a reminder to the galaxy that some decisions carry weight beyond politics. That fairness, morality, and the rights of living beings cannot be overridden for convenience or profit. Their departure was a lesson, delivered without words, without violence, but with impact greater than any speech or weapon could achieve. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, the Council began to realize that life without humans was harder than expected. Disputes escalated. Minor wars almost erupted. Trade routes broke down. Systems that had once functioned smoothly began to falter. The absence of the humans' calm guidance was felt everywhere. Delegates who had once dismissed Earth's influence now whispered quietly in meetings, acknowledging that something profound had been lost. And all the while, humans continued to observe. They recorded data, took notes, and quietly learned about the consequences of moral compromise. But at no point did they intervene. They did not dictate or punish. They did not act as judges. They simply watched like witnesses to a story unfolding, a story that the galaxy had written for itself through decisions made without conscience. It was becoming clear. The humans had introduced a new kind of power, not the power of fleets or weapons, not the power of wealth or influence, but the power of principle. The Council, for all its experience and history, could not predict how such a power would shape the universe. And that uncertainty, more than anything, terrified them. Somewhere in the vastness of space among stars and planets, ordinary beings began to talk about humans differently. They were no longer the young, inexperienced newcomers. They were something else entirely, a species that could act without fear, a species whose choices carried consequences not because of force, but because of integrity. They became a mirror for the galaxy, showing what could happen if even one species refused to participate in injustice. By the end of this period, the message was unmistakable. Humans were not gone. They were not silent by accident. They were sending a signal far louder than any council meeting could contain. A signal that morality, courage, and refusal to compromise were forces in themselves. Forces that could influence millions, even across light years, without firing a single shot. And the Council, for the first time in its history, understood something fundamental. Humanity's departure was not rebellion. It was not protest. It was not retreat. It was a statement, a declaration that some principles are worth more than every alliance, every treaty, every star system combined. For the GE, months had passed since humanity had left the Council chamber, and the ripples of that decision were now spreading across the galaxy. The Council's control, once seemingly unshakable, was weakening. Worlds that had once relied on Earth's voice for guidance were beginning to question every decision, every policy. Even the smallest colony realized that the humans' absence created opportunities and dangers. For the first time, many species felt what humans had always felt on Earth, the weight of choice. Without the quiet mediation and moral presence of humans, small disputes erupted into larger tensions. Trade agreements collapsed when merchants argued over contracts. Borders that had been respected for centuries were suddenly contested. Old rivalries, once kept in check by diplomacy and good faith, began to surface again. The Council tried to respond. Delegates sent envoys, issued warnings, and convened emergency meetings. They issued statements declaring that everything was under control. But the words felt empty even to themselves. The humans had shown that rules and treaties only held meaning when people were willing to honor them, and when humans were no longer present. The galaxy discovered how fragile that honor truly was. Back on Earth, humans watched everything unfold. Their decision to step back had not been easy. Every diplomat, every engineer, every observer understood the consequences. They knew that disputes and confusion would rise in their absence. They also knew that this was necessary, a lesson for the galaxy about the cost of choosing efficiency over morality. Despite the tension, humans did not interfere. They made no threats. They sent no demands. Their influence came from observation alone. By refusing to participate, they were teaching an essential truth. Sometimes the most powerful action is restraint, the quiet power of choosing to walk away. Meanwhile, in the Council chambers, frustration was growing. Some delegates openly criticized the humans, calling them reckless, stubborn, and childish. Others quietly admitted that perhaps humanity's absence was a reminder of what they had lost. The Council had been so focused on efficiency and order that it had ignored the human values that had helped hold the galaxy together. Fairness, empathy, and integrity. In the colonies, ordinary people began to feel the impact more directly. Traders found it harder to move goods. Farmers discovered that shipments of essential materials were delayed. Scholars realized that educational and cultural exchanges had slowed. For centuries, humans had acted as intermediaries, smoothing out the friction that naturally arose between different civilizations. Now, without them, the galaxy experienced the friction in its rawest form. And yet, despite the challenges, there was a new sense of clarity. People began to question old hierarchies and outdated systems. They debated policies, negotiated for themselves, and looked for ways to solve problems independently. Humanity's absence forced others to grow, to take responsibility for their own decisions. In a strange way, the vacuum left by Earth's departure inspired innovation and self-reliance across many worlds. Back on Earth, the human observers continued their work. Scientists and engineers tracked the movement of fleets, studied political developments, and monitored trade networks. Diplomats analyzed messages sent between worlds, looking for signs of change in attitude or approach. But unlike most other species, humans did not manipulate events. They recorded, learned, and waited. The choice to remain apart was deliberate. Humans understood that direct interference could be interpreted as dominance, as aggression, or as punishment. That was never the goal. The goal was to demonstrate that a species could act according to principle, and that the absence of compromise on moral grounds could alter outcomes on a scale never imagined. In the council chambers, the High Speaker convened a meeting to assess the growing instability. The discussion was tense. Delegates spoke of trade collapses, failed negotiations, and rising tensions in sectors that had been stable for centuries. No one could pinpoint the exact cause, and yet everyone sensed the truth. The human's absence was the source of this new reality. "This cannot continue," one delegate said, her voice trembling. "We must reach Earth. We must force them to return." The High Speaker glowed brighter, its voice reverberating through the hall. "We cannot force them. We can only hope that they choose to come back." A silence fell over the chamber. For the first time, delegates realized that their power had limits. There were consequences to overreach, to choosing convenience over justice. Humanity had reminded them that not all species could be controlled or persuaded by authority alone. On one distant planet, a young scholar spoke to his peers about the humans' decision. "They have left not out of anger, not out of fear, but out of principle," he said. "And that principle is more powerful than any fleet, any weapon, any treaty. It is a reminder that integrity cannot be bought or forced." His words spread quickly, carried by communications channels and word of mouth. Across colonies and minor worlds, people began to discuss what the humans had done and why it mattered. Some debated, some admired, but all recognized that the humans had set a standard. Even within the council, private conversations reflected a growing realization. "We underestimated them," an elder diplomat whispered. "We thought they were naive, emotional, and inexperienced. But they are neither. They are deliberate, principled, and unafraid. And now, they have reminded us what we are missing." Despite the disruption caused by their absence, the humans continued to focus on observation rather than interference. They sent missions to neighboring systems not to control, but to offer aid where it was needed. Medical supplies to worlds affected by trade delays. Communication support for colonies struggling with coordination. Every action was small, deliberate, and ethical, demonstrating that humans acted from principle, not power. This quiet influence was unlike anything the galaxy had seen. Humans did not need fleets or armies to make an impact. Their simple choice to step away, coupled with their careful ethical engagement, reshaped the behavior of species across thousands of light years. They taught an enduring lesson. Power without principle is fragile, but principle without force can be transformative. Months stretched into a year. The Council continued to grapple with the absence of humanity. Negotiations faltered. Alliances shifted. Minor conflicts threatened to grow larger. But through it all, humans remained steadfast in their choice to abstain from the Council's decision-making. They did not gloat, they did not intervene forcefully, and they did not compromise their values. The impact of their absence was now undeniable. Worlds that had once relied on the humans for guidance began to understand the importance of integrity, fairness, and moral responsibility. Even the Council's most senior delegates acknowledged that human actions, or in this case, their deliberate inaction, had created a new kind of respect, a new awareness among the galaxy's civilizations. In quiet meetings across human colonies, discussions were held not about how to return to the council, but about how to continue observing, learning, and guiding indirectly. Humans had chosen to teach the galaxy a lesson through example, demonstrating that the power of principle can outweigh the power of coercion, fear, or control. And as the council struggled to maintain order, humans continued their work without fanfare. Their ships moved silently between colonies carrying supplies and aid. Their scientists studied patterns of trade and communication. Their diplomats sent messages not to demand compliance but to offer insight. Humanity's influence was subtle but undeniable. A quiet, moral force shaping events without force, without threat, and without compromise. The galaxy began to understand something extraordinary. The humans had not abandoned responsibility. They had not abandoned their world, their colonies, or even their neighbors. They had abandoned participation in a system that had lost its moral center, and by doing so they had created a new kind of power, the power of ethics, the power of integrity, and the power of principle. In every corner of the galaxy, species began to reflect on their own actions. Leaders asked themselves difficult questions. Were their decisions truly just? Were they serving the greater good or simply convenience and efficiency? Could they stand up for principle, even when it meant walking away from comfort and certainty? Humanity's departure had sparked more than instability. It had sparked thought, reflection, and awareness. In choosing to walk away, humans had reminded the galaxy that morality is not negotiable, that conscience is not optional, and that even one species can inspire profound change without force, without domination, and without threat. And so, the galaxy watched, unsettled but attentive. They saw a species whose choices were guided by principle rather than power, whose actions, or deliberate inaction, could shift the behavior of countless civilizations. Humanity had abandoned the table, but in doing so, they had reshaped the rules of the game. The Council, once confident in its control, now faced a truth that could not be ignored. Humanity had left, but their presence, their influence, their example, and their unwavering commitment to what was right would be felt across the stars for generations. The universe, it seemed, was watching. The galaxy had changed. The absence of humans from the Galactic Council was no longer just a curiosity or a shock. It had become a test, one that every species was being forced to navigate. Worlds that had once depended on human guidance now struggled to manage their own affairs. Without mediators to prevent conflict, minor disagreements grew into serious disputes. Trade routes collapsed, alliances faltered, and even the oldest civilizations, which had maintained stability for millions of years, felt unsteady. The Council attempted to maintain control, but their words sounded hollow. Delegates debated endlessly, making plans that never seemed to work. Some wanted to demand humanity's return, sending fleets to their home system or issuing ultimatums. Others feared that such action would backfire. The humans had not left out of anger. They had left because of principle. Trying to force them back would only prove that the Council had misunderstood the true nature of human strength. Humans, meanwhile, watched from a distance. Their ships moved calmly through their colonies, observing developments in neighboring star systems. Scientists and analysts tracked the effects of the Council's decisions. Diplomats studied interspecies negotiations, recording patterns of conflict and cooperation. Yet humans did not intervene. They did not push, threaten, or manipulate. Their power was in restraint, in the demonstration that ethical action, or the refusal to act unethically, could resonate across light years. In the Council chambers, unease grew. The absence of humans was no longer merely inconvenient. It was destabilizing. Minor colonies questioned the authority of their regional governors. Trading partners refused to cooperate without human oversight. Even long-standing alliances began to fray, as every species realized how much they had relied on human wisdom, fairness, and mediation. The Council could give orders, pass laws, and hold meetings, but without humans present to inspire trust and accountability, their influence was crumbling. Have we misjudged them? A delegate whispered in private, speaking to a colleague from another world. We thought humans were young, inexperienced, even emotional. But they were deliberate, principled, and unafraid, and now we are paying the price for underestimating them. The other delegate nodded slowly. It is not just that they left. It is that their absence is forcing every one of us to see ourselves as we are. that is far more powerful than any fleet or weapon. Across the colonies, ordinary citizens began to notice the shift as well. Merchants struggled with broken supply chains. Farmers faced delays in essential goods. Teachers and scholars found that knowledge sharing between worlds had slowed dramatically. Without humans mediating disputes, even the simplest cooperation became difficult. And yet, amid the confusion, there was a strange sense of awakening. Species that had relied on humans for guidance were beginning to think independently, to take responsibility for their own decisions, and to question old hierarchies. Even within the council, perspectives began to shift. Some delegates realized that the humans had not abandoned responsibility. They had abandoned compromise with injustice. They had refused to participate in a system that prioritized efficiency over fairness, and in doing so, they had exposed the fragility of authority that was not rooted in principle. Private conversations acknowledged this quietly, often in whispers. The humans had shown that true strength was not in power or influence, but in unwavering moral courage. Human observers continued their work carefully, quietly, and ethically. Engineers traveled to neighboring colonies, helping repair damaged infrastructure caused by trade disruptions. Medical teams assisted worlds facing shortages in supplies, providing aid without expecting recognition. Diplomats maintained subtle contact with other species, offering guidance and advice where it could be helpful but never demanding compliance. Every act was deliberate and thoughtful, demonstrating the human principle of helping without controlling. For humans, this period was also a time of reflection. They discussed the ethical challenges of leaving the council, the responsibilities of observing events from afar, and how best to ensure that their influence remained positive rather than coercive. Their conversations focused not on power or domination, but on maintaining integrity, practicing patience, and allowing the galaxy to learn from its own choices. Months turned into a year, and the effects of human absence were undeniable. Trade disputes that had once been easily resolved escalated. Small conflicts, prevented for decades, threatened to erupt into larger confrontations. Star systems that had relied on humans to mediate cultural and political differences now faced instability. Yet through it all, humans remained calm, focused, and deliberate. They did not intervene to punish or manipulate. They simply observed, ensuring that their presence, or deliberate absence, continued to teach the most important lesson of all. That morality, principle, and integrity carry their own power. In distant parts of the galaxy, conversations about humans shifted from skepticism to respect. Ordinary citizens, scholars, and leaders alike discussed the choices humans had made and the impact those choices were having. "They left," one trader said quietly, "but in doing so they have reminded every one of us that right and wrong matter, that there are some things more important than rules or efficiency." Even within the council, attitudes began to change. Delegates who had once dismissed humans as naive or emotional quietly admitted that they had underestimated them. "They do not act like other species," an elder diplomat observed. "They do not use fear, threats, or coercion. Yet they have altered the course of the galaxy simply by choosing what is right." Across the colonies, humans' approach to observation and aid reinforced this lesson. They helped where necessary, advised where requested, but never imposed their will. Their actions showed that leadership does not always require control, and influence does not always require authority. By stepping back, humans were demonstrating the power of ethical choice, and the galaxy was watching carefully. The council tried repeatedly to assert its authority, but every effort revealed the truth. Humans' absence was reshaping the universe in ways no law, fleet, or decree could control. Species that had depended on human guidance were learning independence, responsibility, and accountability. They were thinking more critically about justice, fairness, and the consequences of their actions. In effect, the humans' withdrawal was not creating chaos. It was fostering growth, awareness, and moral reflection. On Earth, humans continued their careful monitoring. They refined systems to track the flow of resources, communication, and political developments. They studied patterns of behavior, analyzed conflicts, and documented the effects of their absence. Every observation was intended to learn from the galaxy, not to control it. Their goal was not dominance but clarity, to show the universe that ethical action could resonate farther than force or power ever could. As time passed, The absence of humans became a defining factor in galactic politics. Trade networks slowly adapted, alliances reformed, and minor conflicts were eventually resolved. But the lessons of human integrity remained. Leaders began to make decisions with fairness in mind, knowing that humans had set a precedent that could not be ignored. Ordinary citizens began to reflect on their own responsibility, inspired by the idea that one species could influence countless others by holding steadfast to principle. The humans' decision to step away had not been simple or easy. They had understood the risks of leaving the council, the potential chaos it could cause, and the responsibility of observing the consequences. Yet they had acted with courage and deliberation, choosing to demonstrate that principle, integrity, and moral courage matter more than obedience to power or convenience. Across the galaxy, the ripple effect of this choice continued. Worlds adjusted, systems adapted, and civilizations reflected on the lessons humanity had quietly delivered. Even the Council, once confident in its control, had to acknowledge that true influence is not always measured in fleets, armies, or authority. It is measured in the ability to inspire reflection, to foster moral responsibility, and to act with integrity. Humans had abandoned the table, but their presence had never been stronger. Through observation, guidance, and principled action, they had reshaped the galaxy. They had shown that restraint can be more powerful than force, that moral courage can outlast fleets, and that ethical leadership can inspire change across entire civilizations. The universe was learning a profound lesson, that true power is not always visible, and that sometimes the greatest influence comes not from action, but from principle. Humans had walked away, yet they remained at the center of every thought, every decision, and every reflection across the stars. And in doing so, they had changed the galaxy forever. Time moved differently for humans now. While the Galactic Council struggled to regain control over the galaxy, humans observed quietly from their homeworld and its nearby colonies. Life on Earth continued with familiar rhythms. Cities buzzed with energy, research facilities hummed with innovation, and communities worked together to solve everyday challenges. Yet beneath this ordinary life, humans were focused on something far larger, understanding how their deliberate absence would shape the universe. They did not intervene directly. There were no messages to threaten or demand compliance. There were no fleets to enforce authority. Instead, humans used the tools they had always valued most: observation, reason, and compassion. They studied the effects of the Council's choices, tracked the movements of star systems, and monitored interactions between civilizations. By simply watching, they could see patterns that no counselor could predict. In distant worlds, chaos began to grow. Trade networks, once stable and dependable, faltered. Without humans mediating disputes, minor conflicts escalated into serious tensions. Worlds that had long depended on human guidance suddenly struggled to negotiate even the simplest agreements. Alliances weakened. Colonies that had once operated in harmony faced shortages and delays. For the first time in centuries, many civilizations realized how much they had relied on humans, not just for leadership, but for fairness, balance, and moral clarity. In the Galactic Council chambers, frustration had reached new heights. Delegates openly argued about how to respond to human absence. Some suggested sending fleets to demand return, while others proposed economic sanctions on human colonies. But every plan was met with doubt. The humans had not acted out of anger or rebellion. They had simply walked away. There was no aggression to counter, no conflict to contain. Their power lay entirely in principle, and the Council had no tools to manipulate it. Private meetings among Council elders became tense and reflective. "We underestimated them," one said quietly. "We thought they were young, inexperienced, and emotional. But it seems they are neither. They are deliberate, principled, and unafraid, and now we are seeing the consequences of ignoring that." Others nodded, but the acknowledgement did not come easily. Accepting that humans had reshaped the balance of power without firing a single weapon, without sending a single command, was humbling. The Council had always relied on authority, influence, and force. Now they realized there was a different kind of power, a power that demanded respect and could not be coerced. Meanwhile, humans continued to act in small but meaningful ways. They provided assistance to worlds struggling with shortages. Human engineers repaired systems in distant colonies. Medical teams offered help where diseases spread due to disrupted trade. Every act was quiet, careful, and voluntary. There were no demands, no public announcements, no declarations of superiority. These actions were not meant to assert dominance. They were meant to show what humanity's presence could achieve when guided by compassion and integrity. Across the galaxy, the absence of humans was teaching a different lesson to every species. Some leaders began to reconsider their priorities, realizing that efficiency alone could never replace fairness. Ordinary citizens, observing the consequences of the Council's choices, began to demand change in ways that had been impossible when humans had been present. Even those who had previously dismissed humans as naive now understood that their departure carried a message far more powerful than words. The humans, however, remained patient. They did not rush to return to the Council. They did not issue ultimatums. They understood the value of timing and the importance of letting lessons unfold naturally. Their goal was not to control the galaxy, but to demonstrate the strength of principle when it was unyielding, consistent, and ethical. On Earth, conversations among humans were thoughtful and deliberate. They spoke of responsibility, not ambition. They analyzed the ripple effects of their absence and debated how to continue observing without imposing their will. Every decision reflected their belief that influence was more powerful when it arose from example rather than force. Years passed. The Council, despite its efforts, could not restore the balance it had once maintained. Minor wars that had been prevented by human diplomacy flared up. Trade disputes created shortages that affected millions. Star systems struggled to maintain communication and cooperation. Every attempt to reassert authority without the participation of humanity proved ineffective. And still, humans did not act aggressively. They did not intervene to punish or dominate. They continued their quiet work, helping where they could without imposing their will, and allowing the galaxy to learn the consequences of its choices. Their absence paradoxically became their greatest influence. Observers across the universe began to see that the humans had taught a lesson beyond immediate politics or trade. They had shown that integrity and conscience are forces in themselves. A species does not need armies to change outcomes. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to walk away, the wisdom to act with care, and the patience to let the consequences speak for themselves. In private chambers on Earth, humans reflected on the broader impact of their choice. They discussed the ethical dilemmas of leaving the Council, the responsibility of witnessing events from a distance, and the importance of maintaining their values in the face of uncertainty. Every conversation was guided by the same principle that had led them to walk away in the first place. Decisions must be rooted in morality, not convenience. Meanwhile, in the Galactic Council, the absence of humans began to reshape culture itself. Leaders and citizens alike started to reconsider the meaning of loyalty, authority, and justice. Some questioned whether they had been too willing to compromise on principle for efficiency. Others began to develop a newfound respect for the humans, recognizing the courage it took to walk away from centuries of expectation and influence. Slowly, a shift occurred. Worlds began to adjust their policies, inspired not by fear, but by the example of human action. Trade agreements were rewritten with fairness in mind. Negotiations included voices that had previously been ignored. And in quiet corners of the galaxy, ordinary people began to ask themselves how they could act with integrity in their own lives, inspired by the humans who had refused to compromise. The humans, however, remained distant, observing and guiding in subtle ethical ways. They provided support without interference, advice without force, and assistance without judgment. Their actions demonstrated that leadership does not always require presence, and influence does not always require authority. The universe was learning a new lesson, that true power comes not from control, coercion, or fear, but from consistency, integrity, and ethical action. The humans had abandoned the council table, yet they had created a presence more profound than any fleet, any law, or any speech. Their absence itself had reshaped the galaxy, showing that sometimes the most meaningful action is restraint, and that morality can resonate across light years without a single command. In this new reality, humans watched quietly, aware of the galaxy's struggles and learning from the unfolding consequences. They did not act for recognition or glory. Their work was guided entirely by principle. They understood that true influence is not measured by obedience, but by the ability to inspire reflection, ethical consideration, and moral responsibility across civilizations, and so, the galaxy learned to see humanity differently. They were no longer just the young, unpredictable species that had once joined the Council. They were a moral force, a reminder that integrity and courage could reshape systems, influence civilizations, and teach lessons without violence or domination. They had abandoned the table, yet their influence reached farther than any species could have imagined. Through silence, observation, and principled action, humans had become a mirror for the universe, showing what it meant to act ethically, even when it was difficult, inconvenient, or unpopular. They had left the Council, yet they remained at the center of every thought, every decision, and every debate across the stars. The universe, it seemed, was no longer just watching humans. It was learning from them.